Pete Hegseth is the US Secretary of War. I'm not kidding, that's his actual title after the Trump administration renamed the Department for Defense. But soon, he might get an even newer job title, Secretary of War Crimes. At the beginning of September, the US began blowing up boats off the Venezuelan coast by military drone strike, killing all inside. They say that those on board are drug smugglers, carrying narcotics bound for US users. There have been about 20 such strikes so far. Now you might think, well, that's just murder. Those aren't soldiers. No war has been declared. And where's the evidence that drugs are involved? Normally, it would be judges and juries who decide on guilt and punishment if there's a crime. In this case, Venezuelan judges and juries, given the alleged crimes, are taking place in that country's waters. But not in Donald Trump's America, where extrajudicial killing is being spun to the public as a very real war on drugs. The White House has adopted the language of narco-terrorists to describe those on board, aligning their attacks with the kinds of drone strikes we saw in the Middle East during the War on Terror under former President Barack Obama. Now, new evidence is emerging that the US military is failing to even follow the laws of war when it comes to these strikes, with Hegseth accused of giving a spoken order to commit a war crime. On the 2nd of September last year, a drone struck this boat off the Venezuelan coast, killing almost everyone on board, but 2 people seem to still be alive. That's until War Secretary Pete Hegseth is alleged to have ordered a second strike with the words, "kill everybody." The US government has admitted that a second strike did take place, but according to Donald Trump, Hegseth has denied ordering the killing of the survivors. But we know he was there. Now, this is from a Fox News interview shortly after the attack.
So the president is sending a message to other cartels, right?
A very clear one. I can tell you that was definitely not artificial intelligence. I watched it live. We knew exactly who was in that boat. We knew exactly what they were doing, and we knew exactly who they represented. And that was Tren de Aragua, a narco-terrorist organization designated by the United States, trying to poison our country with illicit drugs.
In the White House press room, Carolyn Levitt was asked about Hegseth's role in the attack.
Does the administration deny that that second strike happened, or did it happen and the administration denies that Secretary Hegseth gave the order?
The latter is true, Abe, and I have a statement to read for you here. President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have made it clear that presidentially designated narco-terrorist groups are subject to lethal targeting in accordance with the laws of war. With respect to the strikes in question on September 2nd, Secretary Hegseth authorized Admiral Bradley to conduct these kinetic strikes. Admiral Bradley worked well within his authority and the law, directing the engagement to ensure the boat was destroyed and the threat to the United States of America was eliminated.
To clarify, Admiral Bradley was the one who gave that order for a second strike.
And he was well within his authority to do so. Admiral Bradley worked well within his authority and the law. He directed the engagement to ensure the boat was destroyed and the threat of narco-terrorists to the United States was completely eliminated.
So that looks like the White House trying to put the heat on the admiral who ordered the second strike. But that's consistent with what the Washington Post reported when they broke the story. When 2 survivors were detected, the military commander overseeing the operation, Admiral Frank M. Bradley, directed another strike to comply with Hegseth's order that no one be left alive. People with direct knowledge of the matter told the Post. Now, let's accept for a moment that these killings are legal. Then the second strike definitely wasn't, given the US's own laws on warfare. This is from the Pentagon's Laws of War Manual. Members of the armed forces and other persons mentioned in Article 13 of the GWS and the GWSC, who are wounded, sick, or shipwrecked, shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. Such persons are among the categories of persons placed to order combat, making them the object of attack is strictly prohibited. Those other persons mentioned include militias as well as members of crews and ships, and so it appears to apply here. In a post on X, the Everything app, Hegseth said this about the accusations. As usual, the fake news is delivering more fabricated, inflammatory, and derogatory reporting to discredit our incredible warriors fighting to protect the homeland. Our current operations in the Caribbean are lawful under both US and international law, with all actions in compliance with the laws of armed conflict, and approved by the best military and civilian lawyers up and down the chain of command. Most observers of the US's actions in Venezuela have grave doubts about Trump's narco-terrorist claims. Instead, it's thought that Trump is aiming for regime change in the country. That's certainly the view of Venezuela's government, who say Trump is trying to oust the country's autocratic president Nicolás Maduro. Many analysts agree, although no one really seems to understand why. This is from the Financial Times today. The question is whether Trump can pull off regime change without putting US boots on the ground. The roughly 15,000 US military personnel Trump has been within striking distance of Venezuela is a measure of his ambivalence. By a factor of at least 10, the US presence is too great for even an intensified anti-drug operation. That is why even fishing boats are not safe. Yet the US buildup is too small for a land invasion. This puts Trump in a no-man's land between overkill and underprepared. Donald Trump's and Pete Hegseth's determination to break international law is also likely to bring them into increasing confrontation with the nation's military. In October, a senior US Admiral Alvin Halsey suddenly stepped down from his position, shocking observers. But the reason for Halsey's departure has now been revealed. He was forced out by Hegseth, presumably with the backing of Trump, after he repeatedly raised legal concerns over the drone strikes on civilian boats. Hegseth allegedly told Halsey this when the Admiral objected. "You're either on the team or you're not. When you get an order, you move out fast and don't ask questions." Now, Dahlia, this obviously isn't new in terms of the United States and violating the laws of war, but to do it so brazenly and so openly, that's another thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to, look, the US security apparatus have very few boundaries, and Hegseth has managed to violate even those. I mean, when it comes to extrajudicial killings, the US state is true to this. They're not new to this. And that includes against their own citizens. I mean, Fred Hampton was shot in his home. When it comes to non-US citizens, the rap sheet is even longer. You have drone strikes during the War on Terror. You have conducting torture that violates even the US's own laws. You have the various violations that took place in Guantanamo Bay. You know, that quote from Hegseth saying, "Kill everyone," is almost just like a paraphrasing of Henry Kissinger's favorite quote, which was an order he gave to his deputies in Cambodia, which was to kill anything that moves. So it's not like we had a US security state apparatus that was, by the book and super kind of moral, that now is being perverted by Trump and his lackeys. So there is somewhat of a precedent for this in spirit, but Hegseth is escalating things in three main ways. The first one is, a consistently held violation of the otherwise quite flimsy boundaries that the US Secretary of State had. So, by conducting extrajudicial killings in this way outside of wartime, in foreign waters, it reads like an act of war. You're not supposed the norms governing this up till now have not really, there's an escalation when you do these things and you declare acts of war like this without, for example, congressional approval. Now, obviously, one of the maneuvers around this, which was implemented by Bush and continued under Obama, is by creating endless wars. So, whether it's the war on terror or now the war on narco-terrorists, when you do that, you are able to apply a state of war to outside of the normal environment of war. And that, of course, can have consequences for US citizens when you declare an act of war like that out of the normal boundaries. Hegseth has also become known for a kind of general recklessness that has endangered the lives or potentially endangered the lives of US security personnel, which is sort of a boundary that you're not meant to cross. It's supposed to be a red line. So I'm thinking here, for example, of when he basically gave information about upcoming military strikes in Yemen to a journalist accidentally over Signal. That is a very big security breach, which will be seen internally as a very serious violation. And also the way in which he is going against high-ranking security officials within the Department of Defense, firing people because they are raising concerns about the legality of his actions, or blaming blaming Admiral Bradley, even though there's evidence that the order did come directly from him. It kind of violates these sort of internal, unspoken rules of loyalty within the Department of Defense. So, more so than being an unprecedented violation of human rights, because unfortunately, these violations of human rights are very precedented when it comes to the security apparatus, the manner in which they are done is seen to violate internal codes and causes disruption within the established order. And of course, because this form of recklessness is also potentially putting American lives at risk, which is supposed to be a red line for the security apparatus. But I would say that the US security state taking international law as basically a suggestion rather than a rule is a precedent that historic administrations also need to take responsibility for. When you do these things historically under mainstream political establishments, you can't then be surprised that when it gets into the hands of a more rogue figure like a Trump or a Hegseth, it's going to be used in ways that perhaps you didn't anticipate. But the successful testing and breaking of these boundaries and norms is why Hegseth was put in the position that he was, because it matches the overall, I don't know if we say brand, let's say brand of the Trump administration, which is to basically show that nothing is sacrosanct and nothing is normal. Nothing can be considered the normal order of the day. But the way in which it is violated is, of course, I can have all of these criticisms of the norms and the boundaries that existed in historic US security apparatuses, but the fact is that the violating of those is a step far more away from where I would want the security apparatus to change. I have no problem with bucking establishment trends in the security apparatus, but it's going in completely the wrong direction. And unfortunately for the American people, they think that this is something, these kinds of violations of civil norms, of international law, they think this is something that is just going to be restricted to foreigners who have been comprehensively and completely dehumanized in their eyes. But the fact is that when you have a state that becomes used to exercising authoritarian extrajudicial powers outside of the bounds of normality, that will eventually come for you. And we can see how it's coming for people in the domestic territory of the US. We can see that people with, migrants with settled status, people with settled status, people with green cards who are essentially considered to have many of the same rights as citizens are being kidnapped in broad daylight because of their political speech. We're seeing people of color being kidnapped in broad daylight by ICE on suspicion of having irregular papers with very little suspicion other than the fact that they are Black and brown. We've seen nurseries, schools, hospitals, these places that were previously, for very good reason, sacrosanct. We're seeing ICE raids happening in these places. And it's a tearing up of the order of the day that was ultimately a very flimsy and very conservative preservation of some human rights or some dignity within a state that has a long track record of violating the human rights of migrants and, people it designates as foreign enemies. And the great irony of it all is that, the Trump's voter base is a voter base that is absolutely maniacally obsessed with the Second Amendment and the right to own guns. And the spirit of the Second Amendment is not the ability to buy AR-15s and, shoot people on site on your property. That is not the spirit of the Second Amendment. The spirit of the Second Amendment is about defending yourself in cases of government overreach. And the Trump administration is overreaching in basically every area of life in the US in ways that are about degrading people's civil liberties, long-held civil liberties. And there are no tools that the Americans have to really do anything about it. And it's an irony that an administration that is partly elected by those people who claim to be virulent defenders of the Second Amendment, are allowing the violation of that spirit of the Second Amendment to happen right under their noses with very little pushback, because they think it's going to just be restricted to people that they don't think of as human, whether it's, foreigners or migrants in the US territory who don't have settled status, or even just migrants, full stop.
It's interesting. I was going to make a very similar point as well. So when we learned about the potential war crimes being committed by the United States, the Labour government actually stopped sharing some intelligence with the US because of the threat that it might be used in the Caribbean to be able to commit war crimes, right? And immediately when that happened, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, they're all tweeting out going, they're undermining an ally. They just hate strong, decisive leadership from people like Donald Trump. And I was just like, it's so clear that kind of the base level of conservatism is that it's one rule for us and another rule for everybody else, right? That laws and rules are only ever in place to protect the in-group from the out-group and restrict the actions of the out-group. And it's always clear, as you say, that people are very happy, conservatives more broadly, are very happy to give up what should be universal, broad-based rights for everybody on the assumption that they will only ever be the ones on the side of those getting to impose them on other people rather than it being imposed on them. They always consider themselves to always be safe because they're the in-group, and that's a basis of a lot of, as you say, anti-migrant politics, and indeed a basis of colonial and imperial politics, because that's what this is. That's why they're very happy, in the case of Patel and Braverman, to back the US committing war crimes. In the same way, they're very happy to back Israel in committing war crimes, because they're on the right team. They're on the right side. But there is no universal value. There is only teams and being on the right one, which is, again, as I said, the essence of conservatism in my mind.